Well, I lived immediately opposite Broomfield Park, just by the Garden of Remembrance, and there was very little traffic at that time, and I was actually born there, and from a very early age I was actually one of 6 siblings, and with my brothers and my sister we used to go to the park a lot, mostly, well, initially in a pram, of course, but then from a quite early age I was able to go there by myself or with my younger brother, who, although he was 2 years younger, always we behaved like twins and did everything together. And we used to fight a lot, but we also looked out for each other. So, you know, it was a good relationship. And it was such a wonderful area to play. I mean, at the time, during the war, with so many people away fighting, and fewer people anyway in the world, we used to have the park to ourselves a lot of the time. And when people came in at bank holidays and things like that, we felt a bit usurped. Too many people.
That's amazing. So you had the park to yourself. Also, what would be strange for us today is that often we don't let children go to parks on their own, but you were there on your own.
We were. There were a couple of encounters, but we were mostly afraid of what we called nasty boys, who occasionally ganged up and used to chase solitary kids, but we never had any trouble ourselves.
You wrote a little bit about life during World War II and the cafe in the park, which sounded a real hoot.
Yes. The Broomfield House was used as a hospital for the military, and there were always ambulances parked outside. So what later was used as a cafe couldn't be used, and they set up a hut quite near to the left-hand side of the approach to Broomfield House from the main entrance. And it was just a wooden hut which opened up with a flap at the top and a small counter at the front, and quite young people running it. There wasn't a lot they could sell. There was cake wrapped in cellophane and cups of tea and coffee, though people didn't drink as much coffee in those days. But a lot of tea sold, and particularly to the ambulance drivers and the staff who worked at the hospital. And I often used to work in there myself, just because it was something to do, and I made friends with the people who worked there. And
they appreciated their help, obviously.
Well, I think we appreciated them letting us do it more than they needed the help. But you know, it was a friendship thing, and we enjoyed that, and it helped us grow up a bit.
You weren't evacuated at all?
No, my brothers were, but my younger brother and I were the only ones who weren't, because we were too young at the time that evacuation took place. But all the others went, mostly to Welwyn Garden City.
Oh, so it wasn't too far away. Did you visit them?
No, but they used to come home occasionally. I think my mother possibly went and visited them, but I never did. I did once after the war go with my sister to the people who had looked after her, which was an interesting experience, but I never went out to see them.
Why was it interesting? Was it that it was just a different family, or...?
Well, partly that, and partly you get a picture of what this experience must have been like, and one of my immediate brother upwards had a very bad time in evacuation. He wasn't very well looked after, he had very little to eat, and eventually my mother just said he had to come home, but he was very, very nervous, and he used to say, "Can I really have another slice of bread?"
Oh my goodness.
And so to find the people that my sister had been with were really nice, was, you know, encouraging and sort of straightened out the picture a bit.
That sounds dreadful, doesn't it? Your mother must have been very upset.
She was.
Yeah. There was another little piece here about you when you were one Christmas when you were you had made some soldier suits.
Oh yes, my mother was very good at adapting things, and she did make a soldier suit for me and a sailor suit for my younger brother, whose name is Tim. And we used to help the milkman. Oh no, the occasion that we went over
to the
there
soldiers,
was because there was a Catholic chaplain who was billeted at the hospital, and he used to say Mass there, but he used to have to say Mass every day, and there weren't that many people who were Catholics there, so he used to come and say Mass at our house on a sideboard with a metal suitcase which he opened out into a field altar and had everything there to do the job. And he used to say Mass in our front room. And we went over on Christmas Day to collect him because he was a great friend of ours by then, and he was coming to Christmas lunch. And Tim and I went over in our soldier and sailor suits, and one of the soldiers in there said, "Oh, you know, very impressive, but your buttons need polishing." And he got out a brass button stick which slipped under the buttons and protected the fabric from brass while he polished buttons. And it was very exciting and felt very big.
That sounds lovely.
Yes, it was.
And about the bombing and picking up shrapnel in the park and things like that.
Yes, well, there were a lot of air raids and shell fragments, called shrapnel, used to fall into the park regularly, and my brother and sometimes the sisters used to go over there, and the brother Dominic, just upwards from me, was particularly keen on collecting these fragments. They were very sharp and quite dangerous, really, in some ways, but they used to always have a thin coat of rust on them by the time we went in there, you know, just from the dew. And Tim and I, when we were looking for it, used to say, "Oh, there's a piece," and we'd dash over and pick it up, and they say, "No, that's a piece of bark of a tree." We seldom got it right.
Must have been quite dangerous because you could also find unexploded ordnance and things like that.
No, there were never any of that. The only bombs that occurred, there were one night a bomber trying to escape from the RAF flew very low over Alderman's Hill and Broomfield Park, and just to gain speed dropped its bombs, not targeting anything particularly. One of them did hit some shops in Alderman's Hill. Somebody was killed. Actually saw their leg up in a tree.
Oh my goodness.
But the other bombs fell, one on the pavilion for the bowling club in the park, and the other absolutely harmlessly, except for a bit of damage to a tree in the big field opposite the house,
So
leading up to Powis Lane.
So the house was only...
That was not damaged in any way, no.
Escaped. That was,
Which was as well, considering that it was a hospital at the time.
yes, so that must have been a bit shocking, really, seeing the leg up in the tree. But
Yeah,
little boys quite like that.
Yes, you're not quite aware of the significance of it all.
I just, I'm really intrigued about people swimming in the park, in the pond, because I've read about that, and I just thought, because we don't do that at the moment.
Well, no, they never did swim in the pond in my time. What I was aware of and had evidence of was the fact that originally the biggest pond in the park, which is the one nearest Broomfield Lane, had actually been set up as a swimming pool, and it had a diving board at one end, and it was, you know, a public swimming pool, but possibly just deterioration over a number of years, possibly due to the fact that the war had broken out. No, it had stopped before then, really. It had just grown into misuse. The diving board was very rotten, and the water itself was totally unswimmable in. Nobody ever tried to swim in that, or the other two ponds. The only swimming activity, if you can call it as such, was in the boating pond, which is up by Alderman's Hill, which was really not intended for anything but boats, but children occasionally paddled in there, particularly at the bank holidays and very hot days, and occasionally some of the littlest ones used to swim, but I mean it was only about 18 inches deep, so nobody could do very much there.
Sounds good. Did you know anything about, or did you notice the what we now call the sports field was dug up for vegetables? I've read during the war there were vegetables grown there. Did you notice that?
No, I'm sure I would have noticed.
Yeah, oh, that's what I've read in the history. So maybe
There were
that's
some
incorrect.
allotments that were on the other side of Broomfield Lane, running beside the railway track.
So maybe the historians got their facts
wrong.
But you didn't notice that in the park at all?
I couldn't have not noticed it, you know, if it happened.
You were there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to change that in our thing. Did you ever have a boat that you could sail on the pond?
No, not a sailing boat, but another fun activity, because it was just a huge oval, completely unobstructed all the way round, was to tug a little wooden boat round on a piece of string. And mostly children tied the string at the front of the boat and it just dragged along the edge. But my brothers, being technical, had worked out a way that if you actually put the string through a staple at the side of the boat, then as you pulled it, it went out.
Oh goodness, yes.
And so we had our boat sort of 3 or 4 feet out in the water, and all the other children marvelled at it, and some of the adults too. They were very impressed.
Oh, that sounds good. Was that brother later an engineer?
Well, they all became engineers, except one of them who became an accountant.
Very thoughtful. Now, the playground equipment, I think, was very different. These days we're all sort of health and safety, but I think then they had a huge slide.
Oh, they did. It was enormous. And it had a cabin at the top, and that was supposed to be protective. You know, while you were up there, you couldn't fall out. But then children used to climb onto the roof of it.
Oh, no.
And people, including me, used to climb up the slide itself rather than the steps sometimes. And then, obviously, everyone knows about waxing slides, but this was a very high and very long slide. And once it had been waxed, people used to hurtle down and zoom off the end. And unsuspecting people who came at bank holidays used to send their little kids up there, and they'd go shooting off the end. And then the mothers would complain, "Oh, shouldn't be allowed to be." There's also a roundabout called a witch's hat, which...
Oh, yes, they're banned these days, aren't they?
They are, and they were taken away from there. But at the top, this hat part used to then go in and out at a tremendous pace, and if you ever got your finger in there, I mean, you'd lose your hand.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is why they took them down. First of all, they just lifted them off the pole and anchored them to the ground so people couldn't put them back, and then eventually they removed them. I mean, they were fascinating slides, but roundabouts, but very dangerous.
Yeah. Did you?
But when you think about it, I mean, you know, a lot of the things, like when I went to national service afterwards, the fact that I had been able to do all that sort of thing made me fitter to cope with what army people do. You know, so it's a sad thing in some ways and an inevitable thing in others.
Did you know the park keepers? Were they there all the time?
They were there all the time, but not visible all the time. They were mostly visible when it was really busy. There were a couple of park keepers. One was just rather a miserable-looking chap, but there was a wonderful man called Felix. I mean, I don't think it was his real name. I think we used to nickname him Felix after Felix the cat. And striding around, he used to wear the leather gaiters and a uniform jacket and a very smart cap. And we were terrified of him. I don't think there was any reason to be so, because he was there was just no evidence that he was anything but a friendly person. And if he appeared to be chasing you, which he only ever did at a very fast stride, little kids, if they knew or thought they were doing anything wrong, used to dash away, and he'd just smile and slow down his pace.
Gosh, amazing, yeah. So, I was just thinking, so people used to use that park from all over North London, didn't they?
They did.
So they came high days and holidays. It was a bit like, instead of going to Southend, go to Broomfield Park.
Yeah, there were other parks. I mean, there's Arno's Park, which was not very exciting, Oakwood Park, and of course Finsbury Park, which was still also very accessible to all these people. But it was just a nice park to go to. It was compact. It had so much within a compact space, every kind of activity really. And the house itself by then was a museum and a very worthwhile place to visit.
What were your memories of the house and the museum?
Well,
were the bees there then?
They were there, and not from the beginning, but they were there in the time that I knew it. There was a very good display of natural history things in there. Glass cases full of stuffed birds and things like that, and fish that had supposedly been caught in the ponds. And they were very nicely displayed, they looked very real. And although people sort of think nowadays, oh, you shouldn't go doing that with animals. I mean, animals die anyway, and they were presumably ones that had died rather than being killed especially for the occasion. And it did show you a lot about their natural habitat, and they were very interesting. There were also vast cases of butterflies and moths. Very shallow drawers, and you pull one out, and there they all were displayed, and little description of them. Very beautiful things.
Were there ever any sort of special activities for children during the summer?
Yes, the government encouraged people to stay at home for holidays, and it was actually called Holiday at Home. And the reason was that they didn't want people to be away if their house was bombed and nobody knew whether they were there or not. And also they just didn't really want people travelling around anywhere. And it was more difficult to travel around because all the road signs had been taken away. So in the park there actually was a theatre at one end of the garden just to the north of the big pond, which used to be the swimming pool, which also has a bandstand in it. And this theatre, which could be closed down entirely from the front, mostly had shutters which could then be removed, and there were lots of magic shows and puppet shows and things like that. They were quite well advertised, and children used to flock to them and be very amused by these magicians. And
so lots of entertainment then.
There was.
Were there any concerts on the bandstand as well?
There
for
were,
the adults?
yes. Military bands used to come along mostly, and they were not so much for the children, but sort of a Sunday afternoon activity for people to come and sit in deck chairs and listen and applaud.
Yeah, because we've read and seen that there were deck chairs for hire in the park. I'm not sure
That's
if it was
right, yes.
during your time or
Yes,
later.
it was. Mm-hmm.
So they were there. So there must have been a park attendant who collected the money.
Yes, people like Felix used to do that.
Oh, that's good. Were lots of, I mean, the houses, you know them from when you were young. Would you say there were more houses at the time, or did the houses seem to be very similar to they are now?
Around the park, yes, or rather no. There were a lot more big houses in those days. Families who just had a very big house. I mean, I knew some people who had a house in Alderman's Hill which had a ballroom in it. I mean, of course, it wasn't used during the war, and all these things began to deteriorate, and as happens everywhere now, eventually somebody buys it and turns it into a block of flats.
Yes, we visited a flat for the project, and the flat was built on what was then the croquet lawn of a large house on Alderman's Hill.
Yes.
It maybe we're thinking about the same house, or it may have been another one.
There were so many of them.
So it's full of large
It
houses.
was, yes. Also, talking about houses, there were 3 houses actually within the perimeter of Broomfield Park.
Oh, are there? Goodness.
Yes, up in the north east corner. I drove around the park today, and the gates there are very ordinary, but there used to be 2 very large sandstone pillars and some quite impressive gates hung from them, and they were known as the village gates because Southgate at that time, or the territory area, was known as the village. And just around the corner from there were 3 very, very attractive cottages, beautifully maintained, with small gardens coming out into the park, which I believe were for staff of the park, gardeners and things like that. And then for some reason they were eventually pulled down. I mean, they seemed to be in a very good state of repair at the time, and nobody could understand why. But the space is still there. I mean, you can see it because the path from what used to be the village gates sort of bends round towards Powers Lane after a while, and there's a little bit of a small group of trees there which are in what used to be that garden and cottage space.
Goodness, I didn't know that. So I must have a look there. Perhaps take a few photos. That would be quite interesting.
Yes.
Be interesting to find out why.
Yes, I should think that some historical society must have some pictures of those cottages too, because they, I mean, that area used to be photographed a lot because there used to be stocks on the bit of land on that corner bit. I don't know whether they're still there. Immediately opposite the village gates, the other side of Alderman's Hill.
There's a little sort of wellhead there.
Right.
It says Southgate Green or something.
Oh yes, and as I say, there used to be stocks, but
goodness.
they probably rotted away.
Yeah.
I started school at St Angela's because in those days they had a kindergarten and transition, and during the war there were a number of refugees there as well, and there was a boy in my class called Claude. I was convinced his name was Claude Easy because sometimes the nuns wanted to speak to him privately and used to say, Claude Easy. And so he'd go out, and I told my mother he was Claude Easy, and she said, no, I think she was just calling him to the front of the class.
Oh, that was good. So, were you aware of many refugees and their families in Palmer's Green?
No, very few. I mean, there were a lot of Italians, for instance, and many attended my school, but they weren't refugees, they had just grown up there. And the concept of a refugee really wasn't anything that I grasped. They were just kids in my class who, slightly different, didn't speak English very well. But there was no issue with them, and nothing that made them stand out apart from that, really. And there didn't seem to be many of them.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Fantastic memories there.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you and recalling them myself. Thank you.
Thank you.